Welcome back to Homo Non Grata, the series that shows and tells how America's gay people weathered the Cold War. Today we'll head to the East Coast for a look at what happened when a police department went overboard in a misguided effort to satisfy the local military authorities. The war hadn't been over for long, and the whole nation was still very much in the mindset of bending over backwards to support the boys in uniform, even if it meant tromping on someone else's legal rights, because after all, we got to be ready to take on the commies. It's yet another one the history books left out, and it might make you wonder just exactly what these people thought the war they just finished over in Germany was all about. This is Chapter 8, Committing the Unnatural Act, a victim of victimless crime on the Jersey Shore. Asbury Park is a small seaside town on the famous Jersey Shore. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it became a popular vacation spot for people from Philadelphia and New York City, drawn by a sandy beach and picturesque boardwalk, grand Victorian hotels, concert halls, and a variety of amusements. At its peak, the tiny town that's barely seen more than 17,000 residents at any point in its history was hosting 600,000 visitors each year. Away from the beach and the tourist crowds was a different Asbury Park. The west side, particularly along Springwood Avenue, was home to a thriving black community. Jazz clubs attracted well-dressed crowds to hear top-shelf talent like Ella Fitzgerald and Count Basie, while juke joints, illegal gambling dens, and whorehouses drew an earthier clientele. By the 1940s, the neighborhood became well known as a northeastern hub of music and black culture, a miniature Harlem. Beginning in World War II, soldiers stationed 8 miles away at Fort Monmouth made Asbury Park their go-to hangout. The base hosted the U.S. Army Signal Corps and an officer candidate school, both critical to the war effort. As many as 35,000 soldiers at a time were billeted there. Although the troop count was drastically cut immediately following the war, by the end of 1948 the ranks had swelled again to 15,000 as the government anticipated a new situation in Korea. Men in uniform flocked to Asbury Park for a night of fun, either the beach side or the west side, depending on the individuals and their particular tastes. Springwood Avenue could be a very rough place. The 13 licensed bars spread over a half-mile-long strip were often the scene of brawls, beatings, robberies, and an alarming number of stabbings. Prostitutes routinely stole from would-be customers who were too drunk to fend for themselves. Soldiers stationed at Fort Monmouth or Fort Hancock, an artillery training center a few miles up the coast, were common targets of these crimes. With all of this going on, it's difficult to imagine a few gay men added to the mix would be much cause for concern. But the U.S. military reserved a special, oddly schizophrenic disgust for homos. When the psychiatric community convinced the Army shortly before World War II to examine new inductees and scream out homosexuals, it was because gay men were thought to be neurotic, prone to hysterics, unable to work well with others, and unfit for military service. The Army doctors led their supervisors to believe they could spot any homosexual in the course of a brief interview, based on a handful of telltale signs, relying heavily on gestures and mannerisms and a family background that checked the right boxes for breeding sexual deviance. Those who admitted to being gay but didn't fit within the narrow-minded view of what a homo should be were prosecuted and jailed as draft dodgers. For the first time, thanks to their psychiatric staff, the military was seeing gay men not as ordinary people who misbehave, but as a different type of person entirely. At the same time, homosexuality was viewed as a contagious disease that could infect an entire battalion once it was introduced. Commanders truly saw their young recruits as boys in uniform, inexperienced in the ways of the world and easily corrupted by evil influences. When gay bars were put off limits to servicemen during the war, it wasn't to keep gay soldiers from acting on their impulses, it was to safeguard the presumably innocent ones from being led astray. In the interest of public welfare and morals, as one such order read. Homosexuals were believed to be intent on ravaging young soldiers, just as they were driven to prey on underage teens. The menace to national security was perfectly clear. The war against the Nazis and the Cold War against the Communists were cast as moral crusades. Any threat to a fighting man's morality was a threat to the entire nation's military strength. Early in 1949, 3 Fort Monmouth soldiers filed complaints with the Provost Marshal's office of being approached with indecent proposals by gay men in West Side night spots. The Provost Marshal contacted the Asbury Park Police Department, and together they began an investigation. Plainclothes officers entered a tavern in the early morning hours of Sunday, February 6th, and arrested 23-year-old Robert B. Minor, known to friends and family by his middle name, Bernard. Bernard was a black man who wore his hair straightened and long, held in place on that night with bobby pins. He'd grown up next door to Asbury Park in Neptune City, on the waterfront of the Shark River, a broad estuary stretching inland from the Atlantic. At the end of March 1944, he'd been inducted into the Army as an 18-year-old draftee. He was sent to Camp Crowder, Missouri, and assigned to the 81st Signal Heavy Construction Battalion, an all-black unit tasked with building and maintaining battleground communications facilities. After 8 months in the service, he disclosed his sexuality and was discharged. It was a choice often made by gay men who were worn down by the stress and exhaustion of constantly hiding their orientation, or who needed to escape an environment where they were made to feel blatantly unwelcome. Others were tricked into revealing themselves by training lectures that encouraged them to seek help with their problem from the medical staff, not realizing they'd be thrown out of the service. Bernard was released from the Army on a blue discharge. Officially termed neither honorable nor dishonorable, in theory it was to be used for those who'd done nothing wrong but were found to be unfit for military life. The general public had no patience for such subtle distinctions. Blue and dishonorable discharges were thought of as one of the same, issued to criminals and troublemakers, and those who received them were severely disadvantaged when it came to rejoining society and finding jobs. By act of Congress, the benefits of the GI Bill were available to anyone who'd served at least 90 days in the armed forces and was released under conditions other than dishonorable. The clear intent was for holders of blue discharges to be eligible for college tuition grants and low-interest housing loans. But the Veterans Administration denied all benefits to those who were released as homosexuals on the dubious premise that while they hadn't received dishonorable discharges, they'd been separated from the service under dishonorable conditions. Legislators noted the inequity and the departure from their intent, and in 1947 the blue discharges were halted. The release of homosexuals from service now fell into a new class called undesirable, once again distinct from dishonorable, and once again the Veterans Administration refused to provide the benefits Congress had guaranteed. Bernard returned home to Neptune City and settled back into civilian life, earning a professional certificate from a Monmouth County beautician school and beginning his career as a hairstylist. He was known as an intelligent, well-read, and very personable man who loved to discuss current events or share stories with friends and co-workers. He enjoyed wearing nice clothes and dressed in a way that may have been considered on the effeminate side in those days, but not flagrantly so. Until the night of February 6, 1949, he'd led a fairly quiet and trouble-free life. According to the Asbury Park Press, at the police station Bernard complained his hair was a mess because it hadn't been marcelled, a hairstyle consisting of tight waves that was the trademark of Josephine Baker, the legendary dancer and actress. This bit of theater was captured in print to give the impression that he was more concerned with his looks than his legal situation. It may or may not have happened. Arresting officers and news reporters commonly exaggerated or wholly fabricated instances of stereotypical behavior in homosexual cases, partly for a guaranteed laugh, but also to underscore the basic difference between homos and normal people, justifying what otherwise might be construed as unfounded bias. Post-war America spared no pity for a mannish woman or a girlish man. The police hadn't arrested Bernard for any particular infraction. It was a fishing expedition. They'd simply rousted him as a suspected queer. Detectives grilled him on his past. He told them his homosexual activities had begun in 7th grade and continued ever since, even while he served in the Army. Finally, he admitted to having sexual relations on Thursday, November 25, 1948, with a man he knew only as Randolph. While the incident had occurred more than 2 months before, the date was easy to remember. It was Thanksgiving. The two had met that night in a bar, and Bernard took Randolph to a West Side rooming house for a quick hookup. They never saw each other again. With a signed confession in the prosecutor's hands, Bernard was rushed into municipal court and charged with sodomy, punishable by up to $1,000 fine and/or up to 21 years in prison. He entered a plea of guilty and was sent to the county jail in Freehold to await his day in court. Bail was set at $5,000, equivalent to about $62,000 today, an astronomical figure, particularly given the circumstances of the crime. The next day, police arrested 40-year-old Arthur Smith, owner of the rooming house where the hookup had occurred, and charged him with running a disorderly house, generally defined by New Jersey law as any place where illegal practices are habitually carried on. While hardly worthy of investigators' time, together these two arrests continued what had become the new norm of American culture. During World War II, the armed forces had enjoyed a level of cooperation and support from the American public unmatched at any time in U.S. history, before or since. Civilians willingly tolerated rationing of basic food items, shoes, automobile tires, and gasoline, cheerfully participated in drives to collect scrap metal, rubber, and paper that could be recycled and reused for war materials, learned to cope with shutdowns in production of such essentials as new cars, new homes, household appliances, and clothing. This swell of patriotic spirit wasn't completely altruistic. With 14 million men, more than 10% of the U.S. population, serving in the military, virtually every extended family in the nation included one or more in uniform. Production of munitions or military goods provided jobs for 60+ million more, meaning that over half of all Americans were directly engaged in the war effort. By helping the armed forces, they were helping themselves and their loved ones in an easily appreciable way. After the war had ended, the pro-military culture lingered on. Top generals of the Army moved into what had traditionally been civilian roles in the government's upper echelon. George C. Marshall became Secretary of State. Walter B. Smith was named ambassador to the Soviet Union. Both Dwight D. Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur were eyed as prime candidates for the next presidential election. In October of 1945, President Truman lobbied Congress to pass a bill requiring 1 year of military training for all 18-year-old males. The plan was stalled in the House Armed Forces Committee for years and eventually would die on the vine, but a Gallup poll showed 70% of the population supported it. Military service was felt to be a good thing for all the nation's teenagers, for much-needed discipline, improvement in attitude, and alignment with American ideals. Objections which have been made to universal military training, declared General Marshall, give undue importance to restriction on our freedom of life. The commanders of America's military bases had grown accustomed to the sort of cooperation they'd received during wartime, when civil authorities would gladly honor any request they made in the name of aiding the nation's fighting men. They'd fallen into the habit of imposing their will on the civilian population just as they did their own troops. Local officials, for their part, were only too willing to play along. Victory over Germany and Japan had raised the wartime chiefs to almost sainted levels in the national psyche. No politician in America would pass up a chance to do them service and wave the flag, particularly with a war against the Soviets feared to be looming. When the Provost Marshal at Fort Monmouth asked the city of Asbury Park to do something about their homo problem, the police department felt compelled to make at least a token effort. Bernard Minor was plucked out of a bar at random and offered as a sacrificial lamb in clear violation of his civil rights for the purpose of expediency and a show of willing partnership that would satisfy both the Army brass and the department's overseers. Bernard was alleged to belong to a club of about 8 gay men who called themselves the Socialites. They were said to frequent bars in Asbury Park, Neptune City, and nearby Long Branch, sometimes dressed in women's attire. Members of the group accosted soldiers and lured them to disorderly houses where acts of perversion ensued. Assistant Prosecutor Charles Frankel told the court they'd been giving Army authorities much trouble. Asbury Park Police Chief Leroy Holloway milked his moment in the limelight, claiming that numerous members of his department had put in countless hours during the 3-day investigation, and that further arrests would be made as soon as more evidence of indecency was obtained. It's difficult to believe a small handful of homosexuals could wreak much havoc among a fighting force of 15,000. Then again, if 3 soldiers had felt the need to seek protection for the Provost Marshal's office against one 23-year-old gay man with bobby pins in his hair, Mr. Frankel and Chief Holloway may have had a valid concern. Harry Giberson Jr. was assigned to serve as Bernard's defense attorney. Immediately, Bernard's plea was changed to not guilty, and a petition for bail reduction was submitted to the Monmouth County Court. Giberson explained to the judge that Bernard had been arrested without a complaint or a warrant and was jailed before he knew what it was all about. He didn't have the benefit of counsel at the arraignment and made his initial guilty plea without understanding the charges. The bail had been set on that basis. Prosecutor Frankel argued that the large amount was due to the high rate of abnormal sex crimes currently seen in New Jersey, and the only way to curb such practices was to set the bail so high the offenders couldn't meet it. He related a recent story in which a soldier in an Asbury Park cafe had been introduced to a woman who turned out to be a man in drag. There was no evidence whatsoever suggesting Bernard was involved in that or any other such incident, but as a gay man who showed some effeminate characteristics, he was assigned at least a share of the blame. Superior Court Judge John Giordano proclaimed that based on what Frankel had said, Bernard could not be mentally right, and scolded Giberson for wasting his time. Bernard would post the full $5,000 or remain in county jail and await the action of the grand jury. Unable to make bail, he was returned to his cell. On March 24th, the Monmouth County Grand Jury issued an indictment against Bernard for one count of sodomy committed on November 25th of the previous year with a man known only as Randolph. The prosecution of Robert Bernard Minor violated a fundamental rule of Western law. The principle of corpus delicti, literally body of the crime, holds that a person cannot be convicted unless the state is able to prove that a crime has been committed and that the person has committed it. A confession made by a suspect outside of the courtroom is admissible as evidence, but is not sufficient grounds for conviction without corroboration that a crime has actually occurred. Not all U.S. jurisdictions followed this doctrine. In states like Massachusetts and Wisconsin, offenders could be convicted on the basis of a confession alone. A 1947 Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling termed corpus delicti an artificial quantitative rule. But New Jersey had a long history of adhering to the principle, beginning as far back as 1818. A headnote to a 1925 appeals court decision, cited a number of times in the intervening years, stated, "Proof of the corpus delicti is required in all criminal cases." In Bernard's case, there were no witnesses, no evidence, no co-conspirator, no indication at all that a crime had ever taken place, aside from the confession wrested from him under police interrogation. The case proceeded, legal doctrine notwithstanding, and April 5th was set as the trial date. After a jury had been drawn, Bernard suddenly changed his plea to no contest. Judge Giordano set April 21st for sentencing, and Giberson renewed his request for a reduction in bail. This time the prosecutor relented. He agreed to cutting the amount in half to $2,500 if Bernard would first undergo an examination by the medical director of the Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital, a badly overcrowded state facility 20 miles to the northwest. There's no record of whether Bernard posted bail. He'd already been in custody for 59 days. By the time the psychiatric exam could be completed, he would have had barely a week of freedom before returning to court. Moreover, $2,500 was still a daunting figure to meet, and the risk of being examined surely outweighed the potential reward. On the appointed day, Giordano gave Bernard a suspended sentence to the Bordentown Reformatory, a correctional institution for males between the ages of 16 and 30, and released him on 3 years probation with the stipulation that he seek psychiatric help. Meanwhile, Arthur Smith had pleaded guilty and was jailed on the charge of running a disorderly house, a relatively minor offense. He'd be eligible for parole in September. Bernard's sudden change of strategy was almost certainly the result of a plea bargain. It isn't difficult to understand why he took the deal. The judge had already shown himself to be hostile. As a gay black man, Bernard couldn't count on a jury's sympathy or its attention to the finer points of law. It probably didn't help either that he happened to have the same name as a locally infamous character. A different Robert B. Minor had been editor of the New York-based communist newspaper The Daily Worker, and a frequent candidate for political office on the American Communist Party ticket, running for mayor of New York City, governor of the state, and seats in both the U.S. Congress and Senate. While an appeals court would likely have ruled in Bernard's favor if he was convicted, at best the case would have been prolonged by several months. A suspended sentence and 3 years of probation must have sounded very attractive. The action against Bernard by the Asbury Park Police Department and the Monmouth County prosecutor was particularly vicious. While most jurisdictions were content with harassing gay men by trumping up minor offenses like lewd behavior and disorderly conduct, or even resorting to entrapment for soliciting, Bernard was taken into custody without the slimmest pretext of just cause, and then grilled until he gave up enough information to be charged with a major crime. The fact that such information shouldn't have yielded a conviction by the most basic rules of law established by the state was not a hindrance. For a society that had so recently fought a war in the name of freedom and justice, they sure had learned how to play the enemy's game. The Asbury Park Police Department never found any more socialites to arrest, or maybe they were just simply unsuccessful at pressuring them into confessions. In any event, they were satisfied that with the convictions of Bernard Minor and Arthur Smith, the club had been broken up. It seems both the police and the press felt the need to frame the group in that light, as if they wore matching jackets, paid monthly dues, and had regular meetings at a clubhouse. Their attitude spoke to an old irrational fear that all gay men were somehow linked through a shadowy underground network, the same paranoia that survives to this day in the myth of the homosexual agenda. Bernard stayed out of trouble and remained in the Asbury Park area for the rest of his life. He was very close to his family, who accepted him without question. While never entering into a long-term partnership, he had many close friends in the local gay community. On holiday gatherings at the family home, he'd often bring along a friend who had no place else to go. He saw the Springwood Avenue music scene rise to national prominence in the 1960s, only to go down in flames when most of the West Side business district and many of the homes were burned to the ground in the race riots of 1970. And in the 1970s and 80s, with the old beachside Victorian buildings crumbling and the tourist crowds gone, he saw Asbury Park become a popular haven for New Jersey's gay community. Bernard passed away in 1992 at the age of 66. The same year, Asbury Park would begin hosting the annual Jersey Pride Festival and Parade, the largest LGBTQ celebration in the state. Well, that's it for today. Next time we'll take a look at what was a very rare occurrence even during the Cold War. 2 lesbians on trial for sodomy in a small Pennsylvania town. We'll also see how the sex laws were written in various parts of the U.S. and how they were more wildly different from one place to the next than any other area of American law. You won't hear about it anywhere else. Don't miss it.